Now, we have reached the place of the book of Exodus, which is the description of Moses and the people of God in Egypt, to the place where they are about to be delivered by God out of bondage, as God had promised to Abraham. Remember, during God's covenant and his relationship with Abraham, he had told Abraham that his people would be multitudes, many people, like the sand on the sea, of the seas, the sands on the beach, that many people, and that these would be his chosen people, but that his descendants would go through a period of 400 years when they would live in a foreign land, which turns out to be Egypt, and then they would be delivered and go to the land that Abraham promised, God promised to Abraham, which was Canaan, which is now Israel. And so we are to that place where, look at what they have been through. Remember when the children, a family of Jacob, entered Egypt at the beginning of this 400-year period. You remember the background, it's in the scripture, I won't go back through that. But at that point, when they came to Joseph, and Joseph implored out of his relationship to the Pharaoh that his family, because of the famine and them needing protection and to be in a safe place, could they come and live in Egypt? And the Pharaoh agreed to that. But at that point, there were only 70 people in that family, including Jacob and the family of his 12 sons. So we are now 400 years where they have been living in a very fertile, a very populous area of Egypt as a people. And it has been estimated that they have grown, the 70 people that would have been the tribe of the Israelites, has now grown to between 1 and 2 million. Scholarship seems to downplay it toward 1 million, and it's all over the place, but that's what scholars do best, is get all over the place with different opinions. But let's just say that we are, with the scripture noting 600,000 at the time of the Exodus, men above 20, let's just pick approximately 1 million people. That is a lot of people, particularly when you go to a point where scholars seem in pretty much agreement. At that period, the population of the Egyptians was only between 3 and 5 million. Now think about that for a moment. Having a population of, say, 3 million, and you have growing inside of your country with your population approximately another population of a foreign people who are there, and it's 1 million. That is a huge number of people living right there in your midst. And one of the great dynamics of the Exodus that I think you can plainly see is that the Egyptians were becoming very restless with having this separate group that had developed over as long as anyone could remember, and something was going to have to give. The Egyptians were afraid it was a national security issue with them that there were so many of these people. And it is curious. It's a question that I've actually never heard asked, but I ask it now. How did a foreign people grow up and live among the regular population of Egypt for 4 centuries, twice as long as there has been a United States of America? 4 centuries without being assimilated into the population and thus being part of a melting pot, so to speak, becoming part of the Egyptian people. Well, that is a very curious phenomenon, because never in history has anything even approaching that occurred. Assimilation is a natural process that occurs with humankind. The longer you are among a different population, the more the differences disappear and the likenesses accelerate. But that didn't happen here. We'll explore that in this segment further, but in other segments that we come to. God's intention from Genesis and from the creation, it has become apparent, was for all created people to become his people. Now, he didn't start out doing it that way, though, did he? He took a very curious, you might even say strange approach to that. What God is doing here that we now can see through Scripture and through history is that he has to do 2 primary things in order to form this religion of the one true God, which became the Judeo-Christian religion, now 2.5 billion throughout the world. He first needs to reveal himself. Well, in order for God to reveal himself, his nature, his power, his requirements, he's got to have a people to reveal it to. So we have 2 dynamics that are at work at the same time. Remember that to this point, during the whole 400-year period that the Israelites spent as a virtual foreign subjugated people in Egypt, we didn't have much revelation of God. The most thorough revelation that had occurred 500 years before to Abraham and God's relation to Abraham. And the basic formation of the theology of this God to his people has one principal foundation, and that is God's covenant with Abraham. You obey me, and I will bless you. Now, it's a little more complicated than that, but that's the basic principle under which theology has developed under God's revelations at that point. So during all of this 400-year period, all of the Israelites really had to dwell upon and to form their faith around was this covenant, and as part of that covenant, that they would be in bondage for a 400-year period and that they would be delivered. Compare that to the theology under which we operate today as a church. Much, much different. Why? Because God's revelations have expanded like this, and God's chosen people have expanded like this. And they both worked together. You need the revelation of God. We need to know what God is about. We need to know who God is. Remember, in the last segment, we talked about when Moses came to assume leadership of the people, God told him to tell Moses that, to tell the people that God has told me to tell you to do this. And Moses' answer, when God told him this, he says, well, who am I to tell them who is this God? Who are you? And God said, I am, meaning the one true God, Yahweh. So we have the beginnings of the formation of faith. We have to have God revealed to be acknowledged, and we have to have people to acknowledge him. God's revelation is happening very rapidly now. It's really astounding that the limited revelation that God had in his relationship with Abraham, his son Isaac, and his son Jacob is just being repeated over and over again. But there's no idea of what the ultimate purpose is, as we now have and even know as a matter of faith. We've got something that is being added that is extremely dynamic. God is about to act in a forceful way on various levels. The first thing that's happened is he has chosen and anointed the first prophet of our faith, the first prophet in the Bible, Moses himself. God is using him, his talents, and his leadership in order to begin to progress toward Christ. And we can see that. Scripture points it out in various ways. So what is God doing? He takes Moses and he is talking to Moses at an intense level of what he wants done and how it's to be done. Now Moses is the first prophet, speaking for God, acting under God's authority. That's what prophets do. Moses is not the first disciple. We now know from principles of discipleship, the disciples of God, the disciples who become the disciples of Christ. We now know there are certain principles of discipleship which you have an urgency to develop, or you would not be watching these segments. One is growing to love God, to trust him, and to be obedient to him, and to act within that obedience on his behalf. We have several other that have gone before Moses that did that. Noah did it. God revealed to Noah, had a relationship with Noah. It wasn't very complicated, even as much as it was with Abraham. But God had a purpose: build the boat. Noah was a man of God. He did what God commanded. He built the boat, and you know where it went from there. Then Abraham takes on many more attributes of discipleship. Less so Isaac and Jacob. They are continuing that kind of relationship and discipleship that is so necessary and so important. Now we have this powerful figure, Moses, appears. And he is more than a disciple because he is God's anointed leader, speaking with God's authority on issues that his people heretofore had known nothing about. Take, for example, the massive accelerated revelation of God, the plagues. The God is now acting to deliver his people as he had promised. But there's something very important in the way of God doing that. It's called Pharaoh and the Egyptian army and the Egyptian people. And they worship different gods. They've got a whole panoply of gods that are the Egyptian gods, none of whom have the characteristics, but all of whom claim the power of the Hebrew God, the one true God that God is revealing himself to be. So God is accomplishing the purpose of redemption, but at the same time, he is also teaching the Egyptians and their false belief in these variety of gods, Osiris and Isis and on, that they aren't really gods at all. Why? Because they don't have the power to accomplish what is at hand and what has been stated to be done. At the same time, we have the issue of God's chosen people who are to become the Judeo-Christian people of which we are a part. They have developed up into a people of, say, 1 million people. Well, they aren't just 1 million people. We now understand, and they began to understand, that they were God's chosen people. They were the people that God was developing as a seed, as it were, for the later proliferation into the whole world. And one of the attributes of these seed people, this faith in one true God, this development of this faith, this development of this religion, was a very unique attribute that we mentioned earlier. They viewed themselves as set apart, cohesive, not only a cultural people or a race of people, all of whom have traditions and all of whom have things that they have developed to call themselves a people. They are developing the notion, the idea, and the understanding that not only are they people like others, they are people who are different because they have set themselves apart under God's direction to be different in the worship of this one true God, the adherence to this one true God, to be different from the other people in both nature and character. So we have all of the elements as we approach the Exodus, the Passover, and then the journey into the Sinai desert for 40 years. We have all of the elements of the religion of one true God coming together. But now what we are on the verge of adding, as we will quickly see, is that in order for this religion to be an effective religion, a religion that succeeds, if you will, you have to have a formalization of things such as organization itself, rituals, commandments, laws, symbolisms of various things, and scripture, writings. And it all begins with the Passover and the Exodus and the beginning of the writing of the Bible is about to begin. the record of how it all was done and how it must be done now. And every bit of that starts with the Exodus and the Passover. Starts now. See you next time. Thank you.